Just how much better is the defensive secondary moving into 2024 from 2023, and why Howie Roseman made a conscious effort to completely overhaul this position. Talking all that and more on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome on into yet another edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. I'm your host, Gino Camilleri, host of the only daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, delivering you 5 episodes each and every week. And on today's episode, Howie Roseman, in his press conference yesterday, talked about how he felt it was his responsibility for the letdown of the defensive secondary in 2023. Just how conscious was he moving into this year to overhaul that position? The practice squad is assembled. The Eagles signed 14 players to their practice squad today, and they still have 3 remaining openings. Who did they add? Who could they still add? And finishing up today's show with what's the word on UDFAs? Just how hard is it to make a roster according to the numbers as a UDFA? But first, this episode is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So if you listened to yesterday's show when Lou and I were talking about our initial reactions to the 53-man roster, towards the end of the show, I paused for a second. I asked Lou, I said, Lou, let's take a step back for a second. Let's go back about 6 months or so. What is one position that you feel much better moving into 2024 than you did, let's say, prior to the draft or at the end of the 2023 season? For him, he said linebacker. I think that's probably one of the positions that a lot of people would say. I think you could look at cornerback. I think you can look at safety. Oh, that's just the entire defensive secondary. And that brings me to something that Howie Roseman said in his press conference that I really wanted to highlight, because there are a lot of people in the NFL that they overtalk and underdeliver. Howie Roseman is one of those guys. When he talks, he's going to leave you breadcrumbs to exactly what his plan is. So yesterday, Howie Roseman was asked a question on the defensive secondary and the lack of depth from that 2023 unit. Howie replied with this quote. He said, I feel I needed to take responsibility for not putting our coaches in a good enough spot in the defensive backfield last year, and I don't want it to happen again. Now, that's great in theory. When you walk off the field in Tampa and you just see how badly your defense performed. Howie Roseman not just realized that that was an error going into that season, not bringing back Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, not having the depth at safety, maybe not having as many guys at corner as you wanted, and just an downright poor group of linebackers. Howie Roseman didn't just say he was going to make a conscious effort. He did make a conscious effort. Now let's just start at the linebacker position. And while I'm saying this, just think in your head, are these players better or worse than they had last year? Because to me, this 2024 roster, it's deeper, it's younger, it's more athletic, and it should provide you some sort of stability as opposed to last year. Because let's start at linebacker. You started the year with a combination of Nicholas Morrow and Nakobe Dean going into the season. Dean, of course, gets hurt. So how does the season end? Well, you had 4 linebackers on the roster. Zach Cunningham, Nicholas Morrow, Shaq Leonard, and Ben Van Sumeren. 75% of those guys are no longer in Philadelphia. Out with Cunningham, Morrow, and Leonard. In comes Zack Baun. In comes Devin White. In comes Jeremiah Trotter Jr. In comes a healthier Nakobe Dean. And in comes a rejuvenated Ben Van Sumeren in year 2. Linebacker. That's an upgrade. Let's talk about a cornerback. Out goes Roby. Yeah, you remember Bradley Roby? He was playing snaps at the nickel cornerback position for this football team. That was because Avonte Maddox was not fully healthy for the year. Out goes both of those two individuals. Avonte Maddox moves to safety. Bradley Roby no longer in Philadelphia. Josh Jobe is no longer here. James Bradbury has been demoted. Heck, let's move to safety while we're at it. Kevin Byard, that trade didn't work out. Terrell Edmunds was moved out halfway through the year for Kevin Byard. Clear that they wanted to upgrade. And Justin Evans. Justin Evans was the number 2 to Reed Blankenship to start this season. So out goes Roby. Out goes Jobe. Out goes Byard, Edmunds, Justin Evans. Demoted our Bradbury. Demoted our Avonte Maddox. In comes Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. In comes Eli Rodgers. Isaiah Rodgers, excuse me, not Eli Rodgers. I combined Eli Ricks and Isaiah Rodgers. That'd be a heck of a football player. But in comes Isaiah Rodgers. In comes Quinyon Mitchell. In comes Cooper DeJean. In comes Akili Ringo, who's bigger, stronger, faster, more athletic. Howie Roseman made a conscious effort and he delivered. It was a promise that he had to make to not just himself, but to the coaching staff. Because what is the personnel department's job? It's to set up the coaches to succeed. And he said it himself. Verbatim. I feel like I need to take responsibility for not putting our coaches in a good enough spot in the defensive backfield. Accountability starts at the top and trickles its way down. That's the one thing that I have to give Howie Roseman a lot of credit for over the last couple years, is putting his ego to the side a little bit. There was a time, and we've talked about it on LOE, where Howie Roseman thought he was smarter than everybody else in the NFL. Well, that's just not how it is. Everybody has to take swings, and you got to hope that you got more swings of the bat than everybody else. Doing things like signing players off of practice squads as opposed to signing UDFAs, which we'll talk about, how hard it is to make a roster as a UDFA. Making a conscious effort to not leave a position in flux heading into week 3 of the preseason, where you have to bring in 5 different linebackers, and one of which is Miles Jack, who ended up retiring and then coming back. The safety position, much better than it was last year. Cornerback, much better than it was last year. Howie Roseman made a promise to himself, to the coaching staff, and to the personnel, and to the players in that room. Because he owes it to Darius Slay. He owes it to these young guys. He owes it to Chauncey Gardner-Johnson. He owes it to put the best players on the field and not try to just put Band-Aids out there. If 2023 wasn't the final straw that broke the camel's back when it came to just stopping the Band-Aid signings, then Howie Roseman truly hasn't learned. But to see the overhaul, the massive overhaul, we're talking about 10 guys that you shipped out of town that are no longer here, or either demoted, or no longer in starting roles. Now it's up to Vic Fangio and those guys to go and deliver. But Howie Roseman did a really, really good job overhauling that unit. If you're listening to this and you don't feel better about these 3 defensive groups, and the defensive line, probably a wash. I think you could kind of get caught into the picking hairs, like Baskin-Robbins. What's your preference and flavor? Do you like them younger than they are now? And you still have the BGs, but they're going to be more in a role that's suited for a veteran type of guy. The defensive secondary was the biggest weakness. They couldn't stop a nosebleed. I think Lou and I probably could have got 9 other guys and put up a couple yards against them. But this year, it's not going to be the case. And it starts with Howie Roseman. It starts with him assembling a really good 53, a really good 90 man, and then finding a way to protect those guys that don't just make the 53, but also make the practice squad. And that's what we're going to talk about. The Philadelphia Eagles signed 14 guys to their practice squad today. Who's in? Who do they have left to sign? Continuing on this episode of LOE. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Game Time. If you love going to concerts as much as me and my wife do, heck, we went to Red Rocks for the first time since we lived out here in Colorado, and we got tickets through our favorite ticketing partner, and that is Game Time. Game Time has a new feature called Game Time Picks that makes getting tickets for your favorite live events even easier. Game Time Picks filters out the fluff to show you incredible deals to get great seats so you don't have to waste your time searching through thousands of tickets. Right now, if you are a fan living in Arizona, you can get 50% off tickets to the Dodgers at Diamondbacks game on Labor Day, and it's exclusively on Game Time. There's a limited availability while supplies last. Right now, use that feature of Game Time Picks to grab a ticket and take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your purchase. That is your first purchase. Will take $20 off by using code LOCKEDONNFL. Terms apply. Again, create that account and use code LOCKEDONNFL. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, everydayers, welcome on back. Gino Camilleri on this Wednesday edition of LOE, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, delivering you a daily show on the Philadelphia Eagles. And that's why you're here, to learn more about the Eagles. And what did they do today? Well, them as well as everybody else. The only time the NFL does this, they release waivers around 2 in the afternoon, or it might be noon as opposed to 4 p.m. So we found out pretty early that the Philadelphia Eagles, one, did not have anybody claimed that they waived yesterday, and two, they did not claim anybody to their roster that was not on the roster already yesterday at this current point in time. So that means that no additional waivers. Nobody is going to be leaving the 53. Who they have on the 53 yesterday is exactly who they have there today, but they were able, as well as the rest of the NFL, to start compiling their practice squad. So let's figure out how this puzzle came together. Who did the Philadelphia Eagles bring back? Who did they lose? For those of you on YouTube, I will pull up the Eagles Twitter account with the practice squad. For those of you listening along, I will go through each player. Starting off, Philadelphia Eagles brought back linebacker Oren Burks. A little bit shocked on Oren Burks, to be honest with you. I thought he could potentially be one of those guys that might go to another team, let's say a Tennessee Titans, a Carolina Panthers, where they're clearly not one of the best teams in the NFL, but they might have an opening for a player like that to contribute right away, as opposed to in Philadelphia, where you have 5 deep at the linebacker position. Maybe this team sees him as a special teams threat that they could elevate on game days. Maybe they see him, if one of the guys does go down, that he could be the next guy up. But he's the one who I thought they weren't going to be able to bring back. But they did. Oren Burks is back, as well as a veteran wide receiver, Paris Campbell. I don't think he will be the only veteran wide receiver that they add to this group, but they do bring him back. The writing was kind of on the wall when Jahan Dotson was acquired via that trade. He even said in a press conference about a week ago, you got to go out there and earn it each and every day. Tough for him. He was only on the field that last preseason game. If he was there for all 3, probably sneaks his way onto the roster, but more than likely he's an elevation candidate, somebody that they're going to call up multiple times in the first couple weeks, I believe. And hey, he might end up on the Eagles 53 before the end of the year. At running back, shockingly, they only brought back one of the 3 between Kendall Milton, Lou Nichols, and Tyrion Davis-Price. Turns out Tyrion Davis-Price is that guy. They got to feel good about what they have up top. Obviously, you don't need to go crazy stashing guys on the practice squad, especially when you have Saquon Barkley, Will Shipley, and Kenneth Gainwell. Davis-Price could provide you that bigger bodied element to take some of those short area carries away from, let's say, some of the smaller guys like Gainwell or a Will Shipley, or even preserve a Saquon Barkley to an extent. But he is going to be a guy that you develop him over the next couple of years. He might be a guy that makes the roster in the future, but it's a good practice squad stash for now. On the offensive line, they were able to bring back Dylan McMahon. Obviously, no team goes ahead and takes a 6th-round pick from the year prior. There's this brotherhood in the NFL where they just allow teams to kind of get their picks back on the practice squad. They also were able to keep Nick Gates on the offensive line. Nick Gates, this guy has played for 75% of the teams in the NFC East. The Eagles are his third after the Giants, after Washington. He'll probably play for Dallas at some point. But Nick Gates, the talk is, according to Adam Schefter, that the expectation is he would be brought up for week 1. Howie Roseman and Nick Sirianni mentioned in their press conference yesterday that this roster isn't set, and particularly the backup center is one position where they are going to continue to evaluate and continue to construct this roster. And he even said that if you look at how the practice squad is constructed, you could find some of those areas where they might be a little bit weaker. And backup center, Nick Gates, that's more than likely what his role is going to be. At quarterback, they brought back Will Grier. A little bit shocked by this one. I thought they might want to bring in one of these younger, cost-controlled rookies that isn't going to cost or hit you for one of these vested veteran spots. Will Grier, though, that's a really good practice squad quarterback to have. He'll at least be a good guy to run scout for you. He's been around multiple teams, multiple schemes. Good to see him in the building. Not a bad fourth quarterback to have at all. You move to the tight end position. They bring in Jack Stoll. Shocker. Richard Rodgers 2.0, as well as keeping EJ Jenkins. Jack Stoll, I think it was the biggest Eagles reunion that we kind of knew was coming after the Giants. Went ahead and cut him, either him or EJ Jenkins. That's going to be the call up for game day, that third tight end. You'll probably go back and forth between these two, see who is the best guy between them, elevate one of them for the rest of the season after they run out of call-ups. But good to see Jack Stoll back. He's definitely better as a blocker than what they saw out of Albert O, Uzoma, and EJ Jenkins. He's probably the best blocker at the tight end position in this room right now with Dallas Goedert and Grant Calcaterra. And Dallas Goedert, surprise to nobody, he sat out of practice today with an oblique injury. So we talk about how important it is to continue to add at the tight end position. Move to wide receiver. I already mentioned Paris Campbell. The second player, the second newbie outside of Jack Stoll, Marcus Rosemy-Jacques-Saint. Most recently was with the Saints, was with the Command, or actually, he was not with the Saints. He was with the Commanders. Most recently, another Georgia Bulldog, 6'1", bigger body type of wide receiver that the team did a lot of work on pre-draft. They said that they wanted to sign him as a UDFA. They bring him in with Paris Campbell. You got to like who you have on the roster right now. I liked what Britton Covey said in his press conference today, talking about Jahan Dotson coming in and allowing all of them to kind of just play their role and not feel too much of the pressure. I think there's going to be a lot of give and take between these guys, learning and just coming up with new ideas in this wide receiver room of how they can get better. And Paris Campbell, Marcus Rosemy-Jacques-Saint, welcome to the practice squad. Moving to the defense, you keep Gabe Hall on the defensive line. Thought that was one player that you brought him in. You knew he was going to be a developmental aspect. Lou and I loved him going back to the Senior Bowl. Had that over-rip move that just dominated people, but he's at a deep position. You keep him here. You develop him like a guy like Thomas Booker, and you just continue to churn out these guys at the defensive line position. They do such a good job developing and bringing in more and more bodies at that spot. Add in the international player pathway exemption, Laken Vakalahi. He will be here and not count for one of those practice squad spots, which keeps 3 spots still open for the practice squad, because Laken, he would be that 14th, the IPP exemption, keeps them at 13, adding on Andre Sam, Caden Stearns, and Brandon Smith in the defensive backfield. That rounds out the practice squad. All right, my everydayers, finishing up this Wednesday edition of Locked On Eagles. I'm your host, Gino Camilleri. And if you haven't subscribed to the show yet, please go ahead and do so right now. Continue to get those numbers up. It helps the algorithm tell us that you love the show. It gets our name out there to more and more people who could potentially become everydayers. And Lou and I have been here for 7 seasons, over 1,400 episodes. We are not going anywhere anytime soon. We have an actual game to get ready for next week. But to wrap up today's show, I got to get a little sentimental for a second and talk about the guys who arguably have the hardest time making their way onto a roster in the NFL. And those are undrafted free agents. Most recently, the undrafted class from the most recent draft. The Eagles have had success in the UDFA pool at times. If you look at Reed Blankenship, he's the most recent example. You sign him out of Middle Tennessee State, earns his way onto the roster through rookie minicamp, looks good in camp with the rest of the guys, and then all of a sudden he's starting a Super Bowl for you. But more often than not, there's not Reed Blankenships. More often than not, these UDFAs, it might be the last time they ever play a down of football. So, somebody like me who likes the numbers, just how hard is it to make a roster as an undrafted free agent? Well, if you take 32 53-man rosters, that's 1,696 players. Close to 1,700 players. Do you want to take a guess at how many were UDFAs from this class? And I said it if you were listening in the last segment leading into this. The number was 43. It's under 2.5%. 2.5%. So you're talking 2 out of every 100 players are UDFAs. That's incredibly difficult. That's a win for the scouting staff. It's a win for the team. It's a win for the agent. It's a win for the player. It's a win for the university. When all of those things work out, 43 guys did not get their name called on draft day and made the initial 53-man roster. At the extent of some veterans, at the extent of some guys that got drafted ahead of them. But 2 out of every 100 players from the initial 53-man rosters were undrafted free agents from this past class. And why I bring this up is because I live on the internet. I live on Twitter. It's how I get all of my news. I'm not in the NovaCare complex. I got to follow the beat reporters, but this great algorithm that Mr. Elon has, there's this For You page that always comes up. And a lot of the stuff that I see when it comes to some of these UDFAs and how people talk on them is incredibly disrespectful, in my opinion. They like to clown on them. They like to clown on guys who are borderline professional athletes. Like, they're right there. They're right at the precipice. But it's a numbers game. But for those 43 guys that made it, talk about an inspiration. Talk about a Joe Anderson, Buffalo Bills undrafted free agent who made the team. Lucky enough, he came down to our game at CGS in Fort Worth, one of the 6 UB Bulls that we had in attendance this year. Talks to the Buffalo Bills scouting staff on top of all the times that they talked to him at the University of Buffalo. He's a Buffalo kid. There's pictures of him in his Bills jersey going back years. And he made the roster as an undrafted free agent. Talk about inspiration. That's why the NFL is beautiful. Because as much of a business as it is, and the corporate lines and the red tape, and get into all the talking head media nonsense you want, there's a lot of beautiful little diamonds in the rough in this game. Those 43 players thought their dreams were crushed when they didn't hear their name called on draft day. Heck, they didn't even know if they were going to attend a rookie minicamp. But all of a sudden, they make the roster. So it's a little inspiration to you, the listener. Never give up. Never give up chasing your dreams. Follow the inspiration of these 43 guys. Follow the inspiration of guys who have done it before. Reed Blankenship. I'll always be a fan of that guy. Somebody who never had anything handed to him, coming out of Middle Tennessee State of the FCS. Comes into the Philadelphia Eagles safety room, which at the time had a lot of talent. And then he's starting a Super Bowl for you. He's starting a Super Bowl. But if you don't have this UDFA pool, you don't have these guys that aren't the biggest, fastest, strongest, most athletic, they're overlooked, but they love the game and they're willing to come into work each and every day. There's a reason a large majority of rosters, if you look at the percentage of them, it's day 3 and later. You only get a couple picks in the first, second, and third round. Rosters are constructed with these guys. Your average Joes. Your guys that don't fit all the criteria of an A.J. Brown or Jalen Hurts. You need the Reed Blankenships of the world. You need the practice squad, undrafted free agents, the Gabe Halls. You need these guys. These are the guys that are going to give your starters great reps in scout. These are the guys that are going to step up in week 15, 16, and 17 when your starters go down. So to those 43 guys, congratulations to you. And what a freaking inspiring story that is. The Eagles didn't have any this year, but it won't be long if they continue to add talent and overturn every rock to acquire guys for this roster. But that'll do it for me today here at Locked On Eagles on this Wednesday edition of the show. As I said, if you have not subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe to the show. And for your second listen, go listen to the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast just a couple days before the season kicks off. If you want to get all the insight information on how to win your league, go make Locked On Fantasy Football your second listen of the day. But that'll do it for me, Gino Camilleri, here at the Locked On Eagles podcast. And I'll leave you, as I always do, go Birds and fly Eagles fly.